triggered by the request. Like they could see things and give responses. So back to your thing about the one-liner, it seems to me that you can do two things. You can do the one-liner, that closes that, but if there was something in there that could be clarified for that person,
then go ahead and write along.
Then go ahead and give the writer, because that's the job. Because not only do you want to have people know when there is a conflict, you want people to understand why there isn't, so that they can help filter.
So so you could even quote this section of the code where you can give advice, and then you could make it neutral. Instead of referring to this specific situation, you could say, in situations such as, XYZ, a board member or an employee.
Yeah, but you wouldn't have to unless you wanted to publish that one. But I mean, it seems like.
Well, could we have converted that into an advisory opinion?
Yeah. Well.
I mean,
yes.
versus this informal, at least a respectful
Yes.
response to the complainant or to the person in question.
Yes, because or one of the other topics, you didn't get did you get a quiz, Barbara?
We've done this before, though. We should do better the second time.
Yes, I doubt I will.
It's not the same quiz,
Oh,
ladies.
That's too bad.
Maybe there's a couple of
I'm gonna get
things
the
about
right
the quiz
answers
you had
eventually.
before was
Yes, that's right. I
assembly.
did not get the right answers last time, so. Okay, so keep going.
Okay,
How-
so the reason why so let's go over the options. So far we've gotten that you can always give the person the one line. So we're talking about the person who
Made the complaint
now.
Right.
Okay, so then from what you said, I'm gonna assume that the facts that we developed so far were that the complaint, you had enough information to decide that even if this happened, it wasn't gonna be a violation. That's what we're talking about.
Right.
And so then the person who makes the complaint is gonna get the form letter that says the board didn't accept jurisdiction on this because it's not a violation, or whatever. I don't know what that says, but whatever that is, they get that. And that leaves the person with, well, why not? Why wasn't that a violation? Okay, so one thing is then you can attach a right. So you have that part, and then you can do an explanation. And as Barbara said, you can kind of cite to that and say, we give you this for it's like a memo to the file. I mean, you could do just about anything with that, but it wouldn't necessarily be a
public record?
Well, it's always probably going to be a public record, but it's
It was a confidential request, confidential.
right. So so that's why if you have a file memo, how it's supposed to be is that the things when they come in are numbered. And so you're never supposed to be referring to a person anyway. But so however you code it, it's like to this file and there's a number. It's the person who makes the inquiry is the confident. They don't have confidentiality over the subject matter of the thing. You only have to provide that if somehow you think that by disclosing that you answered a question, then it's going to be targeted to them. You can't answer in a way that says.
My concern was that we could end up violating confidentiality in our answer, even though we would just refer to the file number. If we have to get specific into by using an example of something to do with
the
the
chair
case.
of the board. But see, I think that works really well. I think she gets a one-page letter that says, this was not accepted for investigation, and it's got her name and address on it, and it gets mailed to her. And that, of course, is confidential to her. And the second sentence says, please see attached memo. And the memo, as Julia said, is to the file for NOPV number 1, 2012 number 1. And the file memo has no names, and it's generic. It's, it concerns a board or a commission, and I think then you can include that advice or that summary. why you declined it. I think that's really brilliant.
Right, because then what happens is then you guys and thereafter you have also a record on how you handled this situation when it came up before. And if you don't have some way to categorize them, really don't do it. Okay, so that's one way, and it's not a true advisory opinion. The other way to make an advisory opinion has to do with question what? Question 7.
By the way, before we get to question 7, since there are 3 people here, you are on the record.
And even a training activity?
I believe so.
Good.
Public meeting.
Okay.
3 members.
Okay.
It's a public meeting.
Well, it was advertised.
Yes.
Yeah, it was advertised, and if people want to come in, then it would be good to have other seats in the back, so there's
Okay.
not members of the public. We had members of the public attend the assembly training I did.
Okay, so it's number 7. Okay, you, Barbara and I serve as gatekeepers for requests for advisory opinions on systemic issues.
That
Okay,
sounds like the
and-
key word.
Well, I didn't mean it to be the key word about systemic, but, it's issues that can be repeated, I mean, that are general issues, or,
And
you know.
I think this is important because this is a departure from where the past clerk, her views on this, that unless there was a request for either the advisory opinion or the notice of violation, that no other way could it get here.
Okay, and see, that's just so different from my understanding, because not only my understanding, but my understanding of the clerk's position, because one of the very first advisory opinions, which we go over and which I've included in the training materials here, is the advisory opinion number 3 in 2007 from the board, which is still with us today, and is our rule of law, so to speak, on tickets to events such as the charity ball. And that was submitted by the clerk as the gatekeeper. It wasn't submitted, nobody on the assembly asked for that
Right, good.
opinion.
Well,
And so, and it wasn't peculiar to her. She goes to a different table.
Right.
And so the whole history of the code started out with that. And so if there was a retrenchment at some time in not doing that, then that would have been for other reasons, not
Yeah, and
Well,
for
the
code.
ombudsman had that concern.
Well, that's what I'm saying, by the time
Recently,
it
it
gets to.
came up recently in the context of the ombudsman. And so I had explained to the ombudsman in person and then by email, which was shared with Dee, that, yeah, what you do is you take it to either the clerk or the municipal attorney. The ombudsman wasn't a gatekeeper, could be, but it wasn't considered appropriate at that time.
Yeah, and what's good about all of that is, by the time a violation gets here, I've usually had wind of the situation, this quote systemic, 4 times. I've had the ombudsman's call me, a department, a citizen. I mean, I've had 4 calls before it arrives. In fact, I'm the one saying to the poor little citizen, fill out this form. And then the form comes in woefully inadequate. But so this makes absolute sense, is to have the clerk's officer or the municipal attorney be the gatekeeper, get more information, flush it out. You're not taking an advocacy role, we're not usurping but you are a citizen board that has limited amount of time and resources, so.
And the role of the clerk to the ethics board isn't as legal advisor. Clerk was not an attorney,
Right.
and not the attorney to the board, so I don't know how that wrinkle got in, because in response to Daryl's concern and all that, and the emails, Dee came back with the same information that she said. She says, oh, great, but know that this is a direct departure from the clerk's management of these before. And so, if they never consult the
Well, both
code
the,
or
The lawyer.
No, but
Lawyers.
I think the chair, our former chair, the clerk, and I'm not sure, former municipal attorney who staffed this was very hands-off, that if the board had a question, that this is your board, and unless the board had a direct question, so you had a hands-off attorney and the clerk and the former chair here, who very strongly, I mean, this was a hot, we can debated this issue a number of times, it was a very hotly contested issue. And
Yeah, well, I'm sorry that nobody made that
Yeah,
awareness.
so
We
they
could have
mentioned it.
used the very
Right.
first opinion
Right? I mean, it was
as,
a-
Oh, no, I think
That's
this is,
fine.
the systemic thing, I think, is the language that we kind of like, caught on to, because I remember talking about this at the training session we had with the assembly, when we went up to the assembly, and we precisely talked about this particular measure. The concern that we had was like balancing that, and that's why we focused on the systemic stuff, balancing that with the concern of having an individual ask for an advisory opinion about someone else's conduct.
Absolutely.
Right, and that's the problem, because then if you would let people do that, you would not have the confidentiality protections in place because it's an advisory opinion. But it
Also,
wouldn't be
it's a-
about you, it'd be, in other words,
Right,
it'd be a
it's
way
not-
that it
it's-
could be used as a weapon.
and
we
it
wanted
was,
to prevent
and when the code was developed, that's why if you're gonna want something about another person, you file a notice of potential violation. That's what that's called. That's not called an advisory opinion. You can do it, but it has to be a notice of potential violation, and they get to know. And
Okay,
so
but-
they can't shroud it in,
Okay, but Julia,
and that's why the gatekeepers
yeah,
for those issues are these two people.
Yeah.
You know, the municipal attorney and the clerk, to take issues. So an ombudsman issue, yes. Somebody else on the assembly saying, well, I want to find out if it's a conflict for him to do what he's doing. No. Then the advice from the clerk should be, no, you file that as a notice of potential violation. You can't guise a notice of potential violation as a you have to have.
You can't take an advisory opinion as opposed to a notice.
So do you have to, can I just change this and say, you have to have standing to ask for an advisory opinion?
Yes, you do.
Except-
I want to know if my conduct doing XYZ is.
Except for you and except for the gatekeepers.
Okay,
You
So,
might identify systemic problems that you see. So
Yeah.
the ball is a good example. You
So
see
let's-
these tickets
so
are going
let's
out,
actually
and
look
you
at
have
the
no
code.
particular person's
Yeah,
behavior in mind, but you come to realize, I'm seeing a lot of people getting these tickets and they're being given out, and I wonder if that's creating a conflict of interest for
or
a
we have
whole
this
group
problem,
of
there's a
people.
gap in the code, we don't know how these people are being advised on the LRSA boards.
Mhm.
When they don't seem to understand that it applies to them, help us out. That's the job of the ethics board in there. So what we're talking about is under advisory opinion. So I'm on number 7, and we're looking at 115.080B. And this is where you have to have the standing. You know, it says a current or former employee, all these people, interpretation of this chapter in a particular situation involving the inquirer. That's all under A. B says the board may also accept a request for an advisory opinion on a matter referred to the board by the municipal clerk or the municipal attorney. And so you don't have to make sure that the person has standing. The board gets to do that. Those come under A. The ones that come under B are the ones that we have a need to know. And instead of one person filing something on another person or having it come in,
Oh, wait, no.
it just doesn't fit. Nobody's going to want to put in a notice of violation on their board member on a LRSA, but people from the public who don't have standing to ask for advisory opinions because they are not under A,
got it.
then they get to come to the municipal attorney or the clerk, either through the ombudsman or some other the procurement officer could get it, other people could get it and say, look, this is the noise we're hearing. Can we quiet this noise through a request? And those are the two gatekeepers, and that's how it works.
Very good.
Well, it makes eminent sense, because again, it's
Yes.
been up, and most issues have been to both offices a few times before they get here.
Right, and so one of the changes in the code, one of the things that happened under the old code, was that so much of the old code was about elected officials on the assembly, and the school board, I'm not even sure was under the old code, or at least if it was under it, you didn't. I mean, one of the big moves in the new code in 2007 was to make sure that it was absolutely clear that the school board was under.
They're in the code, they're just not considered employees.
Yes, they are. They're defined as employees.
Actually, you
No,
and I
you
had-
and I debated that, and I
and it
said
sh- it
yes,
showed-
they
it
are right
showed-
away, but.
It shows they are not specifically considered employees, but they are under the code and different points.
Well, they're at least elected officials, right?
Yes,
So they're.
so there's, that way, but there's.
Are you talking about the school board? Or
I
the,
think
the
you went
school
to
board
a
is an
definition
employee,
of
school
such.
board is elected official, and the school district employees
Are definitely employees,
Are
yeah.
definitely employees, yeah, but the school board is elected official,
Yes.
yeah.
Well,
So they
there
come
there
under
was
elected
some,
officials.
I forget
Okay,
what
go
came
ahead.
up or how it came up, but there was some discussion
Okay.
here about a month or so ago as to whether school board members were subject to the school,
No, but I'll-
to the ethics committee, and I went
Yes,
I
they
told you,
are,
they most definitely are, as elected officials.
absolutely.
And I forget where it came up.
Oh, there was a lot of discussion, and the school board wasn't so happy about some of that, but also so do other elected officials
Well, we've got,
come under. I mean, the board of supervisors that are elected, we have the Girdwood Board of Supervisors come up on the ballot, and so they're elected officials under here also.
The LURSAs.
The elected ones, not all
Right,
of them are.
the elected LURSAs. We have a fire
Oh,
board.
yeah, that's actually, so what do you make about this? So, you know, a recent conundrum.
Remember, we're on the record.
Okay, right, yeah, so what if you've got a body that is an elected body, meaning that typically it is created through elections. My
On the
understanding
regular, by
on a-
definition, to be elected, it has to be on the regular
Yes,
assembly
it
election.
was.
You know,
Now,
so I mean,
now
just
my
no, it's not
understanding
like.
is that there's some of these like boards and like that. If a replacement is required in between elections, so that a person may be appointed to that board to serve out of it. Now, is that person
That's
an elected
it's on
official
the
or an
body.
appointed official? It's about the body.
It's
It's
about
not the
the
person.
body.
I was wondering.
Right, but to complicate it,
Mhm.
some of those same bodies, those bodies when they're created,
Mhm.
for instance, I'll use the Limited Road Service Board as a general thing of bodies. When the LURSAs were created, they themselves get to decide at creation if they're gonna be appointed bodies or elected bodies. So they're all equal, they're all LURSAs,
But some
but
are.
some are appointed and some are elected.
But if you have an elected
Body,
version
then-
of one of them, and you happen to have a member who's been appointed to
They're
finish
still-
out there,
it's the
they're
body.
still an elected official and subject to that parts of the code.
I have an idea that might help us with that conundrum in the future. I attended the Alaska Municipal Clerks Conference. The Alaska Municipal League is this week, and these guys attended the Lawyers Conference, and I went to the Clerks Conference. And we talked about oaths of office, and they included having, notifying the LURSA members and the fire people to come in and take their oath. And they do the clerk administers their oath or do it at the assembly meeting, and then they sign their oath. And what I realize is, just as Julia just said, you're appointed, but you're still gonna come in and do that oath. And then we move into, I think it solves part of that conundrum because they've just taken the oath. And it's in writing.
Yeah, well, also, there are, sometimes even stricter standards for appointed boards. So they don't get out of it either way, they
Right.
can't, so,
Well,
the,
that was our
the-
issue.
when in doubt, you apply both.
Yeah, that was our issue.
Yeah, that's it, when in
There were
doubt, you
different
apply
standards.
both, yeah. For the person who's appointed.
does the oath say that?
Says I will follow the law. I will follow the Constitution, the state laws of the state of Alaska, and the laws of the municipality of Anchorage. And it appears to me that the ethics code is the law.
Do you need an oath to have an obligation to follow the law? State law,
Well, I think that's but I think
Wait,
it's.
that's a
It
Well,
has
all the
to do
cops.
with, but what,
That's a
no,
philosophy
you
question.
don't.
That's right.
But
Yeah,
what-
there you go.
But what it does create is a cause of action. If not only you violated the law, but you violated your code of office. And so it becomes a grounds for recall, for a whole number of things specific to the office. And so that's why it's important to have it in there, because you're not only are you violating that particular code, but you're violating your oath of office. And when you violate your oath of office, then you're not, you jeopardize your qualification to continue to serve.
And the reason that am interested in this is we're getting ready for our election in April. And one of the concerns is the LRSAs never have the seats filled. And so we've been working about this, and someone told us, well, it's a lot easier to get appointed than it is to come in and declare and all of this stuff. So even though people apparently know they want to get on this board, they intentionally do not declare and run.
Are they subject to APOC rules when they run for that?
I don't know the answer to that, but I'm gonna assume so, because they're
They
an
still have to
elected
file a financial
official.
disclosure with us.
But
anyway,
they
assuming it's
get,
valid.
but they avoid a lot of that scrutiny because they end up being a write-in or whatever. And so I think by saying congratulations, come in and take your oath, and having a packet for all of our elected officials, we avoid that problem. And next time they're gonna say, well, I might as well run because it didn't make any difference.
Or they'll help convert that on a ballot prop to be an elected, an appointed group instead of an elected group. That is their option. They can,
Exactly.
we can put that on the ballot. We get to put that on the ballot, just like we put, having they used to have, all the LRSAs, the people who belong to LRSAs overwhelmingly think it's one of the best things that the city ever did for them, oddly enough. And, but what they were having to do in the original code, the way it was set up, was they had to vote to continue their LRSA every time. And so it cluttered up our ballot, it made a funny, made a funny situation. So we changed it around. We said, and so it took us 3 years to do it, because it was 1/3 of the LRSAs on a staggered thing at a time. And so they all voted to have it be that they would continue and wouldn't automatically sunset. They'd continue until they voted not to continue anymore. And then that made sense. And so we can do the same flip for the ones that are not in there. But Keith brought up another issue that we had some email dialogue on, I think, that had to do with, I'm Julia Tucker.
Hi, Julia Pete Nolan.
Hi,
Nice
Pete.
to meet you.
Here's your kind of workbook. I get it back today, so don't mark it up. And here's a quiz that we're kind of informally discussing, yeah. So one of the questions came up about APOC. And so the facts that were sent to me were, the question that's presented to me was this. And so so just for purposes of our discussion, we're gonna assume that whoever sent me this was correct, because I'm just using it for a point. So the facts were that LRSAs, or some kind of elected board members, weren't within the scope of, because they were limited board service, they weren't within the scope of APOC. And therefore they didn't have to furnish all the APOC stuff. And their position, or the question to come up, is because they don't furnish APOC, then there is no financial disclosure forms for them to have to fill out.
We had to fill out financial disclosure forms, remember, with this board.
Absolutely. So that would cover the appointed board members, right? Because you're an appointed board member, so for all the LRSA appointed board members, It's already in there that they have to fill out that. Well, the elected members, what used to happen was that the ethics code had requirements for all elected officials, which would be, under our definition, the LRSA people fit under all elected officials, the LRSAs that need election, had to fill out a separate financial disclosure form that included pretty much the same thing but in a different format than APOC. So anybody running for election had all the APOC, which at that time weren't as heavy duty as they are now, but they had to do all the APOC. Then they had to re-assimilate the same situation into a form that was required by the ethics code. And so when we went through this, we said no. We said you get to count, if you are covered by APOC, you get to count your APOC one and just file it, and it goes to the ethics board as it. And then you have to supplement anything that wasn't covered in an APOC form. Once you're elected, you have to supplement with these disclosures. So the answer for the elected people on the LRSA board is that even if you didn't have to, the most that we did is allow you to use the APOC form as your ethics submission. If you didn't have an APOC, not being covered in APOC doesn't mean that you're out of here. It just means that your supplement has to be very, very thick, because you didn't have to pull one in for APOC, and you have to make sure that it answers all the financial disclosure things.
Okay, so the short answer is all elected officials have to, if they're not covered by APOC, have to fill out the financial disclosure form that.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and how it comes, and how it's worded in code is that every elected official has to supplement the form that they provided after they get elected with their candidacy with APOC. They have to supplement that with this full disclosure if it wasn't included in APOC. So the requirement in code is that supplement code. So if you didn't have, you don't get to use your APOC to fill that requirement because you didn't have one. So instead of supplementing your APOC, you have to do the full thing. So we covered a little bit before you got here about advisory opinions, and it was number 7 on the quiz. We didn't actually take the quiz in order, right? So the question was, if under the ethics code, the municipal clerk and the municipal attorney serve as gatekeepers on requests for advisory opinions, and I put here on systemic issues coming to the ethics board. And the answer to that is yes, yes. And in your book there, under 180, which covers advisory opinions, you can see that under A, it's very important that the person who is submitting the request for an advisory opinion under A, it has to be about the applicability and interpretation of the chapter to a particular situation involving the inquirer. Because if I'm your coworker and I'm asking the ethics board if something that you're doing is out of line under the ethics code, that would be called a notice of potential violation. I would be telling them something else, okay? And then the assembly and the ethics board at the time that this code was passed in 2007 saw that there was also a need under B to have the municipal clerk and the municipal attorney serve as gatekeepers on noise that came up, on issues that we seem to have a lot of attention, and we need some help from the ethics board. And so they're the only people. The clerk doesn't have to be involved. It doesn't have to be an inquiry on behalf of herself. And the advisory opinion that's included at the back here, which is advisory opinion 2007-3, is an example of this. And this still stands as our guiding rule on whether elected officials can accept the gift of tickets to pricey charity events. And it wasn't expected, the ruling on this matter, the way that this came, the actual analysis here was not what either the clerk or I expected the board to do, which made me all the happier that we presented it to the board, because we would have been ignorant that this was how it would come down. But this is what we follow now, and this is what I teach to the assembly members, and that is that under this rule, the price of the ticket, the advantages that it was perceived to give an elected official to be hobnobbing at somebody else's expense in this event, kind of outweighed public access, and not everybody had the same access. You had there was something here, so it was a gift, and it was not a permissible gift because it didn't fit within the scope of the several examples that were listed there. So,
Julia,
yeah.
oh,
Go
when
ahead.
I have a question that's a little bit different than what you're talking about, so when you're done with this, I'll
Okay,
ask.
so, and in the point that we talked about is that even though apparently there's been other discussion about this, that this is an example of where the municipal clerk, who was not a recipient of this gift, but knew that the assembly was, thought that it was important, and served as in that gatekeeper role and advice on that. Go ahead, Barbara.
Okay, so you were talking about financial disclosures, and Dee just referred me to the page and the site, and it's 1.15.035K. And
Wait a
that's
minute, 115 what?
035.
Oh, yeah.
And then paragraph K, which is the financial disclosure. So, I have a question for you. The clerk is to keep the copy of the financial disclosure filed under state law with APOC. The financial disclosures are now done online, so how do I do that?
Well, you can keep a copy online. You keep a.
So I have to go online and get the copies?
Well, what was done before was that when they filed them, when they were doing a hard paper copy, they were filed, and the clerk's office had a hard copy
Copy.
binder that was available to the public.
Okay.
What you might want to do is create an electronic file of
Okay.
all those things in there that are particular to the elected officials in this municipality, as opposed to
Right.
the hundreds of them that are filed with APOC.
Is it like in a PDF form that you could download and put into your own?
You know, I don't know the answer to that. So, but the bottom line is, so my question is, does the elected official have an obligation to get that to me, or do I need to go looking for it?
I think that the officials, when they submit theirs, should be copying you on
Okay.
it.
But does it say that anywhere? Does it say that? in
Well, it just says,
the
shall keep a copy.
Elected officials shall file disclosures timely as required by state law, which is the APOC form. And then it says, yeah, the clerk shall keep a copy. But it doesn't say how the clerk shall get the copy from the elected official.
And I
Right.
think in the past, they would just bring me a copy, but now that they're doing it online, I think they're forgetting us. I think they're just forgetting that, they're thinking, oh, I've done it online, they just forget about this provision.
Okay, so I don't think that it has to tell them in order for you to get them to file them to you.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, the intent of the language was exactly as you said, that they file
Yeah.
it. And then the downside to them is, if they don't, they're gonna have a much bigger problem, because
Right.
they're not gonna have anything to supplement.
Exactly.
I mean, so that means they have to do a whole new filing.
Okay.
Julie, what would be the problem with having these disclosures put up on the municipal website?
There is none, that's why I'm thinking that that's what she's gonna do, that's what was the intent.
I-
The intent
that's-
before was that they would have a whole paper, at that time, because we
Right.
weren't as automated, they'd have them available so that anybody could come in and look at the disclosures. And so having them on the municipal website is not a bad idea at all.
It's probably very
But
easy to put
and I think, but just to
together.
clarify, I think that'd be a little stronger than saying you should have an electronic copy somewhere in the municipal clerk's office that that you can print out for someone when they come in. And the idea of having a hard copy in a municipal clerk's office has always been sort of a necessary evil. It makes it very difficult for the public to know exactly what potential conflicts elected officials might have. They have to come downtown, if they can even figure out where the proper place to go. It would have been better, and now that we have the web, that we can do this, not just to have these files laying around that citizens can access by coming down to City Hall, but to have them up on the website, so citizens can click and see for themselves what the potential conflicts are.
Do they have access to a computer in the office? In other words, if it is only web,
Hmm.
can you say, here, sit there and press this button?
We do not have that in our office.
Well, you just bought, how many new computers?
Um,
$250,000 or $450,000?
That wasn't me, that was IT.
I know, well.
Well, you could do it, but I mean, like presumably, if you're putting this stuff up on the web, you have an electronic copy somewhere. And so if you have a citizen who comes in who's not using the web and says, I'd like to see a hard copy of, Mayor Sullivan's disclosures, they can do that. But let's face it, for most citizens interested in that kind of information, they're going to go to the web and they're going to see if they can get it on the web first. So I don't see any reason why we couldn't do both. I don't think K requires putting it on the web, but I think it would be good governance to do so.
Well, also, I think that the ethics board can include it on, and ask the clerk to include it on the ethics, have a web location under the code. Because if you see what has to be in here, it's one, the identification of any municipal contracts, the household member, 2, the name of each organization, 3, all that. And then it says, if the elected official's APOC disclosure under 4 includes all disclosure required by this chapter, a supplemental closure is not required. So that's your key, and the purpose is to have those available. So, it seems to me that ethics, just things that are required to be disclosed by the ethics code, can, for not only the public's convenience, but for yours,
Right.
be posted
Oh, absolutely.
on a website.
Could we post their APOC stuff then if they didn't have a supplemental?
Yeah, I think you can do that. I
Because
mean,
of
the question is,
Right.
The relationship of the clerk's office to the ethics board is to provide that support. Legally, yes, you get
Okay.
to do it. It was
Right.
set up so that, it was tried to be open enough so that we could do efficiency and preventive, and public access and things like that. So especially since we've gone to public noticing electronically and all that, and I actually think it is a good idea. I don't know how we do it. We have a microfiche seat available for people coming in to look at things, to pull them up, but it does seem like it would be an efficiency that the clerk's office would want to think about. They didn't have to dedicate a person to go do all that, and things that are on the web, you kind of have a station, here it is.
Mhm.
And employee relations has that where they have in their reception area, there's a computer for the public to
And
apply for
procurement might too,
jobs.
yeah.
Well, the court system has them available too. You walk into the court system, you pull up, they have stations there, you pull up whatever cases you want. I mean, that's very convenient for the public.
Yeah, we should ask IT on the laptops that are gonna be turned over if, and upgraded, if such a limited usage would be,
It can even be an
Inappropriate.
older computer.
Yeah, desktop, because it's all internet based, it have to be a fast computer, it can just be something.
And we're just talking text files or PDFs,
Yeah.
right? It should be-
Exactly. I mean, you could even use the one that's getting people.
yeah, that's what I'm
You're about to
thinking of. We
toss,
have
right?
some,
Yeah.
we have some laptops that are gonna be tossed, cause they
Right.
don't wanna upkeep them, so
That makes a lot of sense.
just bolt them down to the
Yeah.
table.
I think it's consistent with other departments and other services that are making things available to the public on the web. I think it makes perfect sense. And probably easier for the clerk's office.
Yeah.
So another thing we talked about before you got here was, in that the code sort of sets up a two-prong, intake process for the ethics board. And in the first stage is something analogous to probable cause. So there's some language that says, well, if, you don't even take it in if whatever's alleged wouldn't have been a violation in the first place. So it was, the idea of that was to be able to see on its face that, nope, and that's not it. But what's happened is that even if the form is missing a bunch of information about the last time that I was shown some forms for training purposes were disclosure forms from the school district, and there just really wasn't enough information, and that information was within the knowledge of the person sending it in, and so it was just truly an incomplete disclosure. So one avenue for handling those is to make sure that there's a conversation between the ethics board and the clerk's office, so that they're just not accepted yet,
Right.
and put up. There's a gatekeeping function in that capacity. It says, no, I'm sorry, you need to fill out the whole form. We need to know on the face of it what the issue is, or what you're disclosing.
Yeah, we've never really pushed it before, but in what the content of the notice has to include, it says, the person filing the notice of potential violation shall identify the chapter they believe was violated, state why the person signing the notification believes that facts alleged constitute a violation of that section. People do that. And we've never really pushed people on this, and identify any documentary or testimonial evidence the person filing the notification believes are in support of the notification of potential violation. We almost never get that.
Right, but
we almost
that-
never get evidence.
but
Here's
that's a
examples of
piece-
the evidence
yeah.
that I think the good one that we got last summer did, right? But very few of them did. And if you were to say, I was going to say, if Julie were to say that our little pre-informal investigation, if that was not allowable under the code, I was going to start using this to say for some of these flimsy ones, saying, let's just send this back and say, you need to give us more than just accusations. I want some indications of what evidence you think is out there.
Yeah, well, I think
Because
you
it's
should
up.
do that anyway. I
Yeah,
just think
because
that
right
that
now-
has to be in there before each one of these provisions. Not only do we spend time drafting them, and then Ken Stout spent time looking at it, but then we had just work session after work session of debate. So, it took a year for this to get passed. Not because it took a year for me to draft it and send it in. We sent it in chunks. And the assembly really worked hard, because before I started working on it, it had been lingering for like 5 to 7 years, and the ethics board was really adamant that the old code needed to be fixed. And so they weighed in, the school district weighed in, the assembly members weighed in. And so lots of times, if it's a requirement there, it wasn't just taken out of a book and shoved in there. We had, it was like word for word, everything went in there for a reason. And that was one of the reasons we tried to have it be, so that in our vision of how it was going to work in the future, have it be so that the board would have enough to go on to be able to make the determination. If enough to go on to say no, even if all these things happen, this just isn't a violation, but also the flip side of that.
Right.
And
Are you
so,
making your case? Right?
are you making enough of a case, or are you just, blathering?
Well, we talk about that, Julie had said almost we in her view that we can in fact treat our little pre-investigation service like almost like a probable cause here.
That's good.
It is that's sort of the analogy.
Is
So
that inherent
so you
in the
bring
reading of
so
the
so
code?
if it's made it through and you still have to have that in there, then D is a resource. You get, it's sort of like taking judicial notice of different things that are out there, how to have a path forward. Then we talked about, okay, so now we're at that point
Really helpful.
where somebody, where you've gotten that far and now you're at, no, it's not a violation. Okay, so because the person who, the identity of the person who makes a potential violation thing is confidential, then that person, to their address, gets a letter that says, no, we're not taking this because it doesn't meet our, this initial test. And then D saying, but here you have, this is what I heard from all the things that she said, here you've gone through all this trouble to figure out a whole set of facts and an analysis. And not only from what Dee said, not only would the person is getting sort of short shrift by just this one-liner, but also from my view, the ethics board in the future, the whole progression of synthesis and thinking is going to be lost if somebody doesn't make a memo to the file and say, this is what we did, blah, 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 blah. And then there's nothing wrong about including that memo in the file to share with that person. And if you've done it enough so that the identity of the person isn't going to be a target, you make it generic enough about, we looked at a board, it's a board and a commission, whatever, so that they know if it's an elected official, an employee, or a board and commission, because that's how we divided the code. And then give the analysis, then it can go up there as it can go as a couple of things. It can go as an advisory opinion, D having been sort of serving the role as a gatekeeper, as we talked about a minute ago, or it can go under some of the other underutilized provisions of the code that we see under 060. And if we look at 060, duties and powers of the Board of Ethics, another thing that I've talked a little bit here before, and Terry's heard me on this before, is that the existing board at the time really struggled with ways to give advice without having been requested an advisory opinion. And they really wanted to have some other avenues in there so that they wouldn't be seen as being just busybodies or have an elected official get all in a twist because they'd seen things that they didn't understand, plus to have a way to start a conversation if they did see things that they didn't understand that might have perfectly good explanations. And so you'll see that under B is advice, and the issuance of a written advisory opinion is number 6. It's separate from these other ways that the board can give advice, and that was built in there on purpose to give the board maximum flexibility. Keith?
So, I've never seen it happen, but what I have heard it's happened in the past is that board members, when they seen something that was potentially questionable, had to step off the board and file a notice of potential violation or a request for advisory, and then couldn't be part of the discussion.
Okay, so let's back up. If a board member feels so concerned about something that they want to file a notice of potential violation, then they get to do that, and having done that, they need to step off and can't be part of it.
But I would rather handle it more in a discussion mode amongst the 5 of us, and and issue a
And
written
so would I.
advisory opinion. Yes.
That's right.
And
That's why
there are
it's
some
in
things, I have, it hasn't been anything necessary, but if I saw something, I probably would not have wanted to step off the board, but rather to discuss
That's
it.
right.
Yeah.
It's not. You're supposed to be able to be as activist as you want on the preventive law side. The thrust of the code, even though we have notice of potential violations, they're not called complaints. They're called notices of potential violation. We didn't want such an adversarial process. The idea was that if you have everybody thinking about it, just like thinking about safety, I now, from my 6 years of working at Alyeska, I see trip hazards now. I see why it's a bad idea to have file cabinets jutting out like this at eye level while somebody else has their back turned to file things. It's a problem. And so you get a sensitivity. Same thing with the ethics code, because there's not enough of a repair that can be done to that's going to be stronger than correcting the action as we go forward and getting the person into compliance. We want compliance. We want the situation in under compliance. We want it there for the future to go forward. And so that's why it's important to be able to have informal advice and not do retaliatory things. But if a board member feels so strongly that the only way that they want to be able to handle something is by filing a notice of violation, they can't sit on the board for the duration of that.
Well, thanks
They
to
get
your
to
training
file it.
last time on this matter, this is in fact now the power that we use when we deal with the teacher gifts. So the whole teacher gift program of having a form letter that we send out to teachers who get questionable gifts, advising them you may be in violation of the code, it's really not a good idea to accept these kind of gifts, and on the most egregious case, actually bringing teachers in to talk to them. We did not used to
Making
do
them
any of that.
cry.
It was Julia who set us straight. We were like, well, we get these disclosures, and some of them are outrageous, and it seems like, what's our choice? Accept it or not accept it? What the heck does that have to do with anything? And she said, no. Look at this. You can start advise. You can start sending letters out to people. You can do something, and so that's a real example of some
But
of the
we
stuff
just
that
bring them in here, make them sit in that chair and they cry.
Well, the one
Yeah,
did
that was
cry,
hard.
but I mean, boy, she was
But still.
unapologetic.
I wasn't on the board
Talk
yet.
about, like,
Yeah.
I am just gonna jump in here. I don't have that letter. I did look for the
oh,
letter.
right, and I forgot to send it to you.
Okay.
Yeah, it's-
Not there in your computer, you can't.
Oh, I'm sure it is somewhere, yeah. Julie, let me ask you though, one thing that we don't do, if we send an informal letter, so I suppose it would be like maybe under 5, right, advise any individuals,
Whose acts may be subject to
Subject to
provision, right?
Does that letter become a public record?
I'm reluctant to say any of your documents are not going to be public records
Yeah,
unless
right.
it says right here
Right.
that they're confident, because the public records is that unless it falls into one of these categories, and one of the categories is confidential by law or something, and so, there's some things that we get to be confidential by even our municipal code. But if it doesn't say that, then, that is. But the thing is, on the disclosures, somebody would, just because, not every advice, this kind of stuff is a public record if somebody asks for, under the public records document for it. Doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be posted on the web.
Right.
Where those other things.
But in the case of the teachers,
Uh-huh.
and we were sending it to Eric, I believe, and then under a separate envelope, that is supposed to be addressed to the individual teacher, so that Eric doesn't see the letter, right? Because there was some issues with that for a
The one who
fact.
cried complained, yeah, that her letter had been.
But I'm gonna jump in and say, the teacher disclosed it to you, which is public.
Yes,
So
and so
you
that's
can
the thing.
answer
Well,
it.
I guess, but does this go into the teacher's personnel file?
Undoubtedly. Well, it depends if they're
We don't
getting it,
send
right?
it to,
That's
we
right,
don't
we
send
don't
it to
send
school
it to
district.
No, but
so
that's
they
their
put it in the
problem
file.
to work out. The
Yeah.
school district wanted to manage their own personnel thing and their
They're not doing a very
own
good
deal
job of
about
it.
doing it, yeah. So, I mean, because where I was going to follow on to Barbara is that this anticipated that you would get gift disclosures, and when they were a violation, you would tell people they were a violation.
I mean, we have.
And that you could tell them, you can't do that, return it.
Well, but it's-
And until,
it's
but the thing is,
just,
we do that now, but until Julia set us straight on this, we went for at least my first year and a half on the board, it was like, wow, that seems like really outrageous. Oh, well, what can we do? Accept it or reject it? And then people are like, well, what would be the grounds for rejecting it? The form's been filled out properly. Okay, let's just accept it. I mean, how insane is that?
It wasn't a common sense
Right?
thing, and I'm sorry that you didn't have legal advice to
Well, you set it
help
straight
you
there.
through
That was
that
great.
any earlier, because,
But there is a lot of stuff that, I mean, especially politically sensitive stuff, I would love, to be able to send a letter we keep it on a public file somewhere, but have it be relatively under the.
Well,
a
the
few
other
years
thing that
ago-
I think that would be helpful, this is just me talking, but I think it's helpful now that you have some of these issues and you got some solutions about it, but you have some examples, is that before, at the beginning of the school year, or whenever it is that the teachers are having their, district orientation, is that you send out something and say, these are ones that we say are not. And here's what it is, so don't do that, here's the do's and don't list, don't accept.
Well, the example is specific
You know,
disclosure. Well, we do that. No, we actually,
uh,
the district agreed that they were going to include that kind of ethics material in there. That's in there. It's in the teacher orientation. But what we don't do, which is maybe a good idea, is to include specific disclosures and say, here's some of the ones we got last year, and these are not acceptable. And so they
Cash.
have specific
Big old
examples.
Cash,
of that, right?
airplane tickets.
Go diamond jewelry,
Right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
not- Because
How
clearly it's
about
not registered.
tickets-
Clearly, like they
Tickets to a
they
show
say,
that-
To the
"Look, here are these
PAC."
conflict of interest things that you're required, criteria that you're required to follow, and yet they accept it and disclose it. And then like the one who accepted the airline tickets and came in,
And this
she cried, but she did not cry because she was apologetic because she felt she had done something immoral. She was indignant and unapologetic the entire time.
This
She
was
never
the
got it.
nicest
She
thing
never-
anybody ever did for me, is what her comment
What she
was.
said, and then and that's the problem. That's the problem, right? Someone should not be giving something to you that you think is the nicest thing they've ever done for you. When you in
When
turn
their
have to
kid-
give out a resource, right, a good
Yeah,
to
we
their
have to
kid,
grade their
right?
kid.
Yeah, I mean but she did not get. And maybe you're right. Maybe that's a good idea to put specific disclosures and say this is the example of what we're talking. $150 in cash.
Well, I think that you
is
have a
problem.
Blank out the name.
opportunity now with the brand new,
Superintendent.
superintendent to just send the superintendent.
Well,
What was the
I
district?
am gonna make a suggestion that you prepare a memo now, and you could even do it as an action item under new business for your meeting today, and get a memo.
Christmas is coming up.
Christmas is coming,
And
and
it's,
you.
here's the warning, these are in violation of the code.
Well,
But
we
we-
can't. The school board voted that down.
Yeah.
but that was a
We
different
asked
school
them-
board.
we asked them. That's true. We can ask.
But you
them
don't
again.
have to ask, guess what? Stop asking permission for something that the code says you're supposed to be
Because
doing.
they flat refused, that's where, it's the
They
school
flat
board's.
refused.
Yeah, but where
what?
do we put? Well, we wanted it included in newsletters that went out to parents.
I'm
The
gonna.
school send out newsletters.
I
out to
just think
parents
you
a
need
couple
to make
times a
those
year.
letters public, and you need to do them to the superintendent, and and say, here are examples. We suggest you do this and this and this, because you know what? If they don't, then you can put them up on the web. You can start
can,
telling
scarlet lettering
the
people, yeah.
yeah, but I mean, you get to give it out to the public. Don't do this. You're going to jeopardize this teacher.
This raises another question on this particular issue. What do you think about this idea? Last year, we were floating around the
Compass piece.
idea of writing a compass piece.
Yeah.
Either me as chair
Good
or
idea.
as collectively as the board.
Good
And
idea.
we were, actually, the only reason we didn't was that a number of news articles precisely on this issue came out
And
just
they-
around this
and
time.
they
of the year,
interviewed you.
And it was on TV, and we were like, okay, I think we got the message out. But we were thinking about doing that again, would
Ken
that be okay?
Stout
Is there
did
problem?
no, there's no problem. Ken Stout, that's what compass pieces are for.
Right.
And Ken Stout, when we were all doing this, wrote a compass piece and had it published on the ethics code as it was going on to do. I have
Oh, well,
it
this is
framed
great,
in
because
my
one of the things that
office.
held us back, we really, we're all of us are new enough that we really didn't have a precedent for it. It's like, wow, is that stepping beyond the board's traditional roles of getting a little bit too hyperactive?
I think it's part of our education
Right.
role.
It is.
Okay.
Your education role has been underutilized, traditionally, and that's why it was expanded in here and emphasized. Because the other board really wanted to go in that direction, and then they turned out or
Mhm.
did other things or
You
whatever.
know, the school district to get them, they tried, but what are we getting? Less than 10% of the schools?
Yeah, we're getting a fraction.
The previous clerk, they did the analysis and they showed, you've seen the list of all the, no, either that was your department, wasn't it, that did that list of all the schools?
Yeah, I did.
We're not getting near enough. And that's where I think we need to get to the superintendent.
Well, maybe it's time to bring the superintendent in. We had, Carol came in several times and met with us when we were dealing with this issue the first time. Maybe it's time to invite the new
Right,
superintendent.
but I'd have some
Unfortunately, it'll
materials
be
developed first
too-
before you go.
Too late for this
Well, no,
gift
that would be
season.
the continuing
So-
issue with the compass piece can be
Right.
beforehand.
So I still think that for education purposes, I think that the Board of Ethics, which covers municipal employees and school district employees, you know, we have a mass email in the Muni, and if the Board of Ethics asks to have an email sent on our system to all employees, I think that it would be impossible to decline that unless it violates some rule, which I don't see how it could. So I think you can do a memo, as you've discussed, and I think you can send it to the superintendent or the chair, or, you know, two of you, no more than three, could meet with the superintendent and say, we want you to distribute this to all school district employees, you know, as of December 1st. The one thing that I would suggest, I think I've only been here 2 months, and I see exactly what you're talking about. The problem is that I don't see where, if you could offer in your compass piece or in your memo, what's acceptable, so that people understand what, I mean, it's the outrageous ones, which are the nicest gift I've ever received, but what is acceptable? What's an appropriate gift? You know, and I've heard that it's inappropriate to give teachers food, but, you know, the thing is food is consumable, and so consumable stuff is okay.
I kind of like the Boston district policy, because you couldn't regulate it, you just said no more.
No
Right,
gifts.
but I think that that's a good policy. We don't have that. That's not our policy.
That's right,
And
we
so
asked the
that-
school board to do that and they wouldn't, so that's.
Yeah, they
yeah,
adopted
right.
that for their policy. The assembly can legislate new policy, and if it gets to be a big enough problem, that would, I mean, you know, that's the other recourse. But for right now, we're kind of on, what do we have for their employees?
I think it's $50 is that triggers the disclosure limit.
Unless it's consumable, and then it's 75, is that right?
I don't recall
I didn't know they were
It's gonna be
consumable.
under.
I don't
O-
just recall that
it's-
We've never had a
It's
disclosure.
under O3. Well, the idea was you were supposed to be able to give the teacher an apple, okay? So
Right.
I don't like the thing about the consumable, but then you go to, I mean, not being consumable, because I always thought that you could. Now, if it gets to be gift certificates at different restaurants, and it goes on and on,
And some of them get around it by doing a group of parents. And, you know, what's a group? But, in that, we've generally looked the other way. If it's a PTA, we don't have any problem, because the PTA quite often will give $100 to teacher for classroom supplies. And we get these disclosures, and we generally look at them and go, okay.
yeah, that is the way, that's one of the big, acceptable ones.
That has never been an
are-
issue
Are
with us.
teacher supplies, so that goes on the list.
Oh, cool.
A perishable gift for
Right.
immediate consumption or display, that's not a gift certificate to Orsos. From members of the public expressing general appreciation or holiday cheer, shared with the office or group, or donated to charity. The administrative supervisor designating the office or group shall disclose a gift if it's in excess of $150. So that raises the thing, it can go in the teacher's lounge, it can be, or it could be for the whole class. To share in the teacher, you know, it's just, but the important part is that under number 2, when it says, unless rebutted by other factors, an occasional gift worth $50 or less is presumed not to be given under circumstances in which reasonably important the gift is intended to influence a municipal employee's independence of judgment. Well, if you look at this advisory opinion 3 in there, they really worked on that. I mean, that's what they said. It is to a reasonable person, is giving a ticket to this fancy charity ball something that could influence? And they said, yeah, a reasonable person would think it is. This person who is giving the tickets has to come in front of the assembly for budgetary things as part of that independent thing. And to our view, yes, it does. So, you know, if they could see it on a $150 ticket when there wasn't anything direct existing at the time that the tickets were given, that the person gave half the tickets to the assembly and half to the administration so that it wouldn't be a thing like that. If a reasonable person could see that, then certainly they're gonna see that repeated gifts and other things that they're not given under, there's not, you don't have, it can't be reasonably inferred that it's not given to influence treatment of a kid that's in your class. Who's gonna think that? In Virginia, I don't know what the rule was, but, you had it, I mean, there were problems because people.
Now, where we've seen disclosures, the mayor had his education conference. So everybody went to the mayor's education conference, received meals, and some got some transportation and whatnot. It generally amounted to about $229 by the time they were all done. To me, I don't know that was something that we necessarily need to see the disclosure of.
Right, I don't either.
Well,
But
we did,
didn't-
I don't know that obviously
When-
not everybody filed, but we got quite
Yeah.
a few of them.
You know what the list here under everybody's gift list was intended was to create a set to give examples, and other examples could fit in there. I mean, we'd have volumes of everything that was an okay gift. And so one of the ones that I thought was, well, if it's open to if it's a raffle, they get to do it, or this monetary gift under C. And it was Ken Stout that said, well, look, you have to have it be that it's a, this might be under the elected officials, but it has to be, it's here, by a recognized civic or philanthropy group,
Exactly.
because otherwise, he says, they create a new group. He's talking about elected officials, and then they make sure that that person wins the raffle, or, that person gets the thing, so he like really opened, so I had to keep going back to the drawing board and creating some fences around this thing. And in the why one of the reasons why the 2007 number 3 opinion came as a little bit of a surprise to me is that the board really looked at on the assembly side and said, and besides that, we don't see a category that it fits into, instead of sort of creating a category, for it. And so it didn't imply that you couldn't create a category, but I would say even if the one that you gave, when they attended a conference and there are things that are part of the conference and it's done like that, it wasn't intended to be.
That was just a function of their job.
Right. And so one of the things is, this was never intended to cover things that went from something in intra governmental that was part of your job. It wasn't intended to regulate what your supervisor gave you as a gold watch. Somebody asked me, well, geez, they can't do this and this at the fire department. They used to give them, or it was the police. They used to give a guy a gun when he left, and now the police department is saying the ethics code doesn't let them give you a gun. Well, no, there may be reasons not to give the guy a gun, but it's not covered by the ethics code, because part of your thing that they do, it's not covered that. The only reason why the charity ball came into effect is that even though it's called the mayor's charity ball, it's not a government function. The mayor's charity ball is a nonprofit, it's outside the scope. So the ethics code should never be used. These categories don't include anything about what you can give somebody and pay for out of the municipal budget is their severance gift. That's not it. Not the ethics code.
If it's a severance gift, I think you could reasonably assume that that's not going to influence their future decision.
Yeah, if they're leaving, right.
They're leaving. Obviously they're not gonna
Right.
have the same impact.
Right. So there's just no way that although the code may cover elected officials for a certain time after they're no longer elected, It just wasn't the right use of the ethics code. They just-
But Julia, just in someone's defense, not particularly my own, but in the Department of Law's defense, something similar to that came before us a while ago. And it wasn't the ethics code, it was the P&P that the mayor adopted on use of municipal
Right.
resources.
That's why I said there could be all kinds of reasons not to do it.
Yeah,
Whether it's a gun or some other gift, but it's not gonna be because of the
Of the
ethics
ethics
code.
code.
That was a cop-out. Somebody
Yeah.
was saying,
well, I
yeah,
think
giving off
probably
the
the
road.
department misunderstood that, because a similar issue came up either with fire or the police. We have another a P&P, policy and procedure from the mayor, which are directives to the employees, the departments about certain policies that aren't put in code, and they're not elevated to that section. But nevertheless, employers are supposed to follow them, and when that whole fill the boot thing came up, the mayor put out a very long, I don't know, 10, 15-page beginning idea of what, or directive as to what was appropriate in terms of use of municipal resources. So giving a police officer a $500 gun would be a diversion of municipal resources. And so where did it fall under this long? So, and again, I wasn't the person involved with that, but I would bet that was part of that. So there are other sources.
right, and there are personnel rules that take care of it.
Yeah.
I mean, the ethics
Yeah.
code wasn't intended to replace or trump or provide,
Yeah, and
you know, to fill the gap
Right.
in personnel
Yeah,
code
and
things.
another good example is police officers have in their PPs, apparently, their procedures and policies, they cannot accept any food from any group, that it's a given. They cannot, that it's part of that, they cannot accept any level
So
of
you
any
were
gift.
donut deficient?
Listen, in 1977, when I went to the academy, came out of the academy, there was an old practice that directly was related to that at certain restaurants that I could name. Some still exist. And, you know, coming out of the academy, I mean, you talk about, you know, the whole ethics thing coming up about you don't accept anything, you don't take anything. And so when you're riding with your field training officer and some of these old guys have been around a long time, and, you know, you wouldn't, you know, take any, you'd go to pay for coffee, and they go, we don't, you know, don't worry about it, you know, and you just go, and you were educating these guys that, you know, we're in the academy, we're taught,
Yeah.
da-da-da-da. And so that became then, steadfast rule for everybody, that you didn't do it, and then it became P&P, and then you could be fired for doing it. But there were guys that had tabs at restaurants, and where it really came to fruition was where some of the restaurant owners finally went to the chief of police, to the captains, and said, you know, I'm sorry, you got guys who owe us $200, and these were cop restaurants. I mean, where they loved having you there, but they had these, you know, pads, and I mean, it was embarrassing for the department. It was embarrassing for the city, the officers themselves. People were fired, and so a whole bunch of rules came out about not accepting
But
anything.
the problem I thought was that the other side of that is that you're at a cultural event and someone of a different culture offers you food, and a police officer has to turn it down.
Well, I think when you're talking about a cultural event where there's all kinds of people are eating, you know, whether it's because you're there security or
Well,
whatever
not
reason
when there's
you're
a
there.
buffet, but you're somewhere else and somebody offers you something private. You know,
If it's
really
what you're
helped
being
us.
paid, I mean, I think that the difference there, from what I remember, was if you're in a restaurant and everybody else traditionally pays. That's me. I'm sorry, they're trying to get over me. And everybody else traditionally pays, you must pay. And I think that it's kind of a grayer ground if you were at a cultural event, which, you know, we offer you food, and does everybody else have to pay here? And if they do, then I can't accept it. And that was that threshold. Food became a really big deal because if you are eating every day at a restaurant, which you're not paying, that gets into large amounts of money. And if you're running a pad with them and you don't pay the bill 2, 3, 4 months down the road, and a restaurant's, you know, it got really embarrassing. So that all changed in 1978, I think it was. Really became a big deal. So, you know, I couldn't even accept money from anybody who, you know, was, when I stopped them for a traffic stop. I didn't say.
We are on the record.
Yeah, we
But
are.
Dirty Harry never
I'm just
would-
kidding. I'm just
Dirty
kidding.
Harry never would have broken up that robbery
Exactly.
at the diner if he hadn't gone there every morning for his coffee.
Exactly. That's a
His
good
free
point.
coffee, right?
And he wouldn't have been there for anyone to make his day. So, yeah, those things. what
Yeah,
you're
when this
saying,
went into
very much so.
effect, one of the first calls I had was from the APD, and what happened was that they had a vendor who, they had a vendor who provided their coffee machine. It was like out to bid, so there was a vendor, they paid for their coffee or their Cokes or whatever it was. And at either at Christmas time or when there was a death or something like that, the vendor just didn't take the money from the machine or didn't, or, you know, turn the mechanism off so you'd have free coffee. And so the police were so, you know, of concern about that, to wonder if that was allowed to do it. So I had to ask a bunch of questions about, you know, do they choose a vendor? How do they choose a vendor? You know,
Would any of those kind of
things.
issues that are P&P things about meals and stuff for police officers particularly, because they even graduate far beyond what they can or can't do in affecting people's lives?
Do you have a silent function you
I
can put
do, and
that
I'm
on?
gonna put it on right now. How's that sound?
But it did come up, I believe you had just joined the board when we dealt with the other issue with respect to that we started off with was the fireman getting a meal, which was $19 and change.
Oh, that's right, that was the new restaurant,
Yeah, the
there in East Anchorage.
and we said it wasn't a problem as long as it was and they'd already done the inspection.
Right.
Oh, that firefighters
Yeah,
were given
yeah.
a meal there?
Right.
Just for their
Yeah.
opening.
See, are those
was
ethics
for the opening
violations?
of Which is
Those
something
come
they
to the
traditionally
ethics
do
board,
in any
and they-
community they go
Are they things
into.
that graduate more towards more serious thing over that?
That was-
In other
that
words,
was-
if a police officer was not paying for meals and somebody thought, well, that's an ethics violation, would that be the kind of thing, would they file that with us? Or, you know, to the clerk?
I'd say
They
it's
did.
like this.
Right.
The meal, it could be a violation of the P&P and the ethics code, so it's in the little middle of the Venn diagram. Or it could be a violation of the ethics code, but not of the P&P. But I think.
Most likely, it's gonna be a violation of the P&P,
Yeah,
and then some are gonna be a violation also of the ethics code and some not. So just
Right.
because the ethics code says it's okay to take a meal, doesn't mean that the P&P doesn't apply for those other reasons. Cause I mean, I had an assembly member come in one time with all kinds of questions about this kind of thing too, because he insisted on paying for his meal, but he was someplace with somebody else, and then because he was on the assembly, the restaurant guy came and said, "Oh no, your meal's being paid for by so and so." It was some guy in a seat that, you know, wasn't just the ordinary constituent, and for all the assembly member knew, had things coming up on liquor licensing, on, you know, all kinds of things, and he just told the restaurant, "No, I'm paying, here's my money, and, you know, you can put his to your tip or whatever,
Well,
but
this-
I can't do
This
that."
came up for a long time, even when I was in 78, 79, out there on patrol, and then you would go to restaurants and they wouldn't even give you a bill. And you go, "I need the ticket." They go, "Oh, no, it's on the house." And so you leave a $10 bill. You know, you go, "No, I mean, I'm leaving the money." And so you would leave the money. I mean, it didn't matter whether they wanted you to do it or gave you, or somebody was buying you lunch or whatever, it didn't matter. You just left the money. And the only reason why I asked in regards to the ethics is because depending upon the level of whatever the officer's taking, I mean, it's actually a crime as opposed to an ethics violation, you know, where, you know, geez, you get a letter in your file. I mean, sometimes some of that stuff rises to the level of a crime. So I just wondered.
So the
whether-
ethics board gets to refer it
Okay.
to other places,
Alright,
that's what
cool.
happens about that.
Well, and then the other things, there's ethics officers throughout the city, which we've now updated, by the way, we haven't put it in the P&P. And so that may be a police person may send it to their ethics officer, and then that person would hopefully refer it wherever, because they would also know that the police P&Ps.
Right, so it wouldn't have to come all the way up here
Yeah.
just to get a referral back down the chain.
Yeah.
Those
That
are
way,
good
yeah.
questions.
We've updated, we had a whole bunch of people had left, and we've got new ethics officers being trained up as we talk, and they're in different parts of the city, so.
I wonder if it might be a good idea to do a memo to the school board and a memo to municipal employees. Just so that we ask the mayor or the administration to send out a memo to all muni employees reminding them what the ethics code says.
Well, I think that the P&Ps, which we don't pay too much attention to because
Well, that's true.
they don't go, okay. So I think the mayor should have the first shot at reminding employees about what P&Ps are gonna be in effect for the holiday season or whatever that is. Our problem with the school board is that they don't have somebody doing that, and so I think we kinda have to prioritize that. And then the mayor, we can always talk to the mayor about, after we see what he has in mind, or the administration has in mind for for that, so we don't,
Yeah.
you know, so we, because I don't have the same sense that the employees are underinformed.
Or that we're getting a lot of gifts from the public.
Right.
Like teachers are.
Right, right.
Yeah,
I mean,
I
it's
don't
just,
see that
it's
at all.
They don't just
not-
come into your office and just drop stuff off?
You know,
Actually, you ought to see in my office, I get lots of stuff, but, you know.
Because
it's
we-
Generally vendors.
I got an invitation today to a Christmas party for, and I'll just say it, for transit employees. And I just took a look at it because just the concept, you know, that it was, it just bothered me.
You're just on the list they asked everybody, I'm sure.
I'm sure it's a big list, but it's at the IBEW hall, so I'm thinking, okay, that means it's not, but anyway, it just kind of was one of those little things that kind of bugged me. So I think it would be a good idea to follow up and remind us too.
Well, I've had involvement in drafts of that activity, so it's interesting to know where it ended up. I'd love to see your
we
invitation.
can forward,
Oh,
yeah, I
okay.
got a copy too, so we can forward. I'm looking at the clock.
Yeah, we need to.
For you guys,
Yeah.
and so I want to just really quickly run down our test here. So, under the ethics code, the ethics board is prohibited from giving informal advice. So what's our consensus on
False.
that? Are you guys, that's false, absolutely. We have many mechanisms that we talked about today and some others that can be developed under the ethic to give the informal advice. Under the ethics code, the disclosure of a conflict to the ethics board removes the actual conflict.
That's false.
That's false. So this actually came up in, when I was attending my conference, both here and other places. Other places have struggled with something that we're hopefully past the evolution of, which was that somehow in the wording of another jurisdiction's municipal ethics code, once you gave the disclosure, then there was no conflict, no matter how egregious it was, you know? And so when I was first working on this, that was the process with the school district. They thought that their own internal process said that here's how you avoid a conflict. Basically,
announce
you
it.
just announce it, you know? And I'm like, yeah, that's not the, and so I talked to Jeff Friedman, because they'd approved, he said, that's not what we intended to approve, so they had to go back and do that. Okay. To avoid a conflict of interest, only financial interests must be disclosed.
I
I
said
think
false.
that's false.
Right, that's false. We have not only, we have
Yeah,
both
personal conflict.
positional interests as an associative interest that need to be disclosed, in addition to a financial interest.
Yeah, you might
So-
remember, like, so for the mayor's thing, when he cashed in his father's insurance policy, one of the arguments that he made was that there was no conflict of interest because he was actually not a beneficiary of the trust, but he was fulfilling a fiduciary duty, and we said, okay, then that was your substantial interest. You had a substantial interest to fulfill your fiduciary duty, and that was potentially in conflict with your official role as mayor.
And when I most recently gave the ethics code to some training for the elected officials, I didn't have a copy of it, so I pretended that a big pink sheet of paper, and I said, no, the mayor's gonna kill me, but I just want you to imagine a check that's written out to Dan Sullivan as trustee of the trust, signed by Dan Sullivan as mayor. You know, you're working both sides of the relationship. That's the essence of conflict. And another example that Dee worked on was, and my assembly member was there and knew, was where an assembly member has signed a petition signed a neighborhood petition on an issue coming before the assembly. You can't be on both sides of the transaction.
So how did you resolve that one?
So yeah, I
It was
probably
a
had
conflict. It was a
Do you
conflict, and
think
they
it would
could.
be a good idea if, and I said, no, to appear?
So the assembly member didn't vote on that?
Yeah, they
issue?
could, they had to be, well, actually, they wouldn't have
They had to
been,
declare.
but at some point,
Okay.
everything got,
Oh.
whatever that was, got taken off for other reasons, and was gonna come back, but that's the lesson, don't be, I mean, because that's what the, you know, the assembly member said, she's, I just wasn't thinking that, you know, my neighbors approached me and I just signed, you know, can I retract it? Well, it already been published, to go, you're on a petition, if you can't sit as the body legislating on a petition that you've already signed, that's appearing, in that case, that's appearing, you know, in front of the assembly as a private person. You do that, you can't sit and be part of it. Okay. Financial interest must meet every factor in a 5-factor test for elected officials. So let's just look at D, at 035D for a second here.
I think that one's false.
That's right, it's false, and it's one of the areas that I have to talk to assembly members about, because it was never intended to be a checklist, right? You don't have to meet all 5. You don't have to. I mean, these were just some sample. I should have put the word sample factors appropriate for consideration. Are the following, and I just took these.
Well, you did say
Well, you said
include one or more.
one or
I know, but
and
one or more.
factors,
But
and-
the thing was
Yeah.
that you could also not have any of these factors, but you could have
Right,
some
right.
other ones. You know, that kind of meant I pulled these at the time we were drafting. Ken Stout and I went over ones that we knew about had come up in front of the assembly. You know, and I looked at ones that had come before I got there. And ones that I had just seen. I mean, I had somebody give the chair of the assembly said that the chair thought that there was just a conflict on a conditional use permit because her mother was best friends with a woman that owned property in the area. And when that person died, and she was in her 70s, then her mother would inherit that property, and her mother had called her and said vote against the CUP, and therefore she had a conflict. Okay, so no, it didn't fit under any of those rules. But what I decided was, even though the assembly let her off because they didn't know what to do, that you should have a situation where you can say, I have something has happened that makes me not be able to carry out. You know, my mother's word on this is going to influence my decision. I'm sorry, but it is. And so I'm asking you to recuse me because I can't, I'm in that, you know, kind of a bind. And if it happens often enough, then maybe you shouldn't be on the assembly. We should vote your mom onto the assembly. But you know, that's that's a real situation, and it needs to kind of be worked in someplace to the code. So anyway, so they're not supposed to be definitive.
So not only is it not you have to use all 5, and we've always read it that way, that it's kind of like a free-flowing application of it. But you're not limited to those 5.
You're
that
not
would be
limited
news
to
to me
those.
at any rate. Okay, so
Yeah.
you can consider
You're not-
other things as well. So you could say
Right.
you clear 1 through 5, but for other reasons that we have to articulate that, it's still a substantial interest that creates
Right,
a conflict.
and so could it be the other way too? That although none of these things are, here's the overriding, you know, thing. It doesn't matter in the big picture. It's not gonna be that way.
So it's
And
just-
why assembly members in particular have that much leeway is that the state code, which I didn't bring a copy of, but I have the site here too. The state code that requires a conflict of interest proceeding, which is in Title 29. If you're the governing body, you don't. You can have a substantial financial interest and vote if that's how the governing body makes its law. There is no overriding thing that says, it just says that except for the governing body, state law says, except for the governing body, your provision shall provide that if you have a substantial financial interest, you can't take part in it. So even on a substantial financial interest, there's situations where a local governing body can decide that even a substantial financial interest is not gonna disqualify. Our assembly decided to be more conservative than state law allows. And so they said, you know, for the most part, it's substantial financial interest, but there's just a lot of things that you just can't think of. So these were things that I was able to think of, and or that Ken Stout and I were able to think of, and the assembly did that. But we could go both ways. It's sort of, you could kind of, so you could say, you could have a situation. It hasn't come up because my assembly is going to go, here's the list. Do you have this? Do you have this? But you know, they could go through all this and have none of these, but they could have something else that by analogy is the same idea, that there's a whole group of people, you know, that the group, even if it's a small group, it's so generic in its application that this is going to be it.
Well, which was why I was actually pretty gratified on Tuesday night to see an assembly person actually recuse themselves, and you know, and nobody in the room objected, because we've had 2 or 3 advices come across where the assembly people said, well, you know, I got this financial interest, should I vote on, generally the downtown thing here, and we said, well, you're supposed to disclose that to the assembly and let the assembly figure that out according to the code. And since we've done that, we haven't had any more of those come
Right,
back.
so that's one of the preferences that Dee has articulated to me in a way that I understood it, which is that this board is, this board wants to see the mechanism in code for assembly disclosure worked, and not have to have the advisory opinion first to then take it into the assembly.
Well, that,
And
you know, so we meet once a month, it's generally
Right.
not timely enough. We have had to have emergency meetings, and to tell them, like, well, really, why are we even meeting? This, it's right here in the code, says you're supposed to disclose.
I think it's great because the evolution, it means that one, the assembly is getting the hang of doing their process, whereas when we first put this in, I mean, everything, before it was that the assembly could make a ruling, and then somebody could file a complaint, and the assembly's ruling wasn't binding on the board. So you already have action, nobody's asked for an advisory opinion ahead of time, and so the assembly goes through their thing and says, no, we don't see a conflict, and then somebody filed, and so then the person's lured into taking action because their assembly member said it, their assembly fellows said that it was all right. They take action, and then the ethics board goes, ha! Violation! And the ruling of the ethics board, the only time that it didn't trump the assembly member was when the assembly member got an advisory opinion first and acted on the advisory opinion. So now we've gone long enough so that the assembly doesn't have to keep asking for that. We've made that transition, and the assembly and the ethics board is saying, okay, work it. You know, let your people, you don't need an advisory opinion. It's, you know, you do the disclosure, your assembly is going to tell you whether that is or not, and follow that. The board has a different relationship to the mayor, because the mayor doesn't have anybody to go to. We couldn't have the mayor do the disclosures. See, assembly members go to the assembly and say, I have a disclosure, and the assembly votes. It would be a big separation of powers problem if we made the mayor go to the assembly to ask if they had it. So the board has to stand in and serve that same function about the mayor that the assembly does for the individual assembly member.
It seems like it's been 2 years since we've had anything from the mayor.
Yeah, in terms of conflicts.
We, you know, when I first started 3 years ago, you know, we got hit right away with the life insurance policy. I mean, I was barely here a month that we got hit with that,
And then we got like.
and then a couple other ones.
The next couple.
Yeah, well,
So
it
he
was
created a new
burned
form.
twice shy. I mean, we
created
have a lot of
form.
flack.
We created
Yeah,
a new
we created a
form
new
just
form
for
Just for the mayor. But see, that's why you
For all the
get so
family
many.
members.
Yeah.
And to his credit, I think he has figured out. We told him, you know, use your municipal manager. We've gotten around it.
Yeah.
We've gotten figured out how to make it work for him.
Yeah. But that is, he's elected official for some reason, for some purposes, he's, he or she, if in another administration, is a full-time municipal employee, so they're interwoven, and then there's some situations that just are totally peculiar to the mayor. So the mayor, even though they're an elected official, and even though the mayor is a full-time municipal employee, they have a different and special relationship to the board, where the board has to serve as that directed
We know what every
advisor
single
for-
gift that some official gives.
Got it, okay, so the ethics board can overrule the assembly's decision on whether a financial interest is substantial.
Oh, that's false.
Right, and that's because when the assembly makes their decision, then they are the governing body about that, so.
But this is, so Joy, this is that also true for appointed boards? Is that also true for elected boards generally, elected bodies in the municipality generally? From the language in the code, it makes it sound like it's not just the assembly, that any
It's
elected.
any elected body, right, I just
Yeah.
happened to use the
Right.
assembly
So
as
to
an
pick
example
up
here,
the
but
Which I
it's
Larsa
all-
don't
board.
like, we've encountered difficulties in the past where some of these boards, it's one thing for the assembly is the
That's
ultimate democratic
why we
mechanism.
need to have the ability to have an advisory opinion
Mhm.
come in, because just like this one that I have in the back, that's our law now. The advisory opinion, it comes in and serves sort of as a trump that way. And so, and that's why the advisory opinion can, and that advice can be in, these generic ways to say this is what applies. They can't, a board can't, a board can't avoid the law by twisting the term
Yeah,
about
but
it.
what they can do, which I don't like, is they can basically do what the assembly does, right? They can have just egregious conflicts. And you have a small board, everyone's kind of conflicted in one way or another, and they say, oh, well, we'll just let this go. Someone then files a notice of potential violation, rightly pointing out, hey, look, by the standards of the code, this is a real serious conflict. By common sense, this is a conflict of interest, and by the code, it's a conflict of interest. And the person successfully defends themselves by saying, well, I disclosed it to the board, and they voted that it was okay.
We did have a
So-
case that unfortunately the complainant violated confidentiality, so we didn't get to finish it. That would have brought the board, that one particular board in front of us a couple of years back, because we felt exactly what he was saying, that they were kind of, they had a member on a board they were sit on one side of the table and they go on the other side of the table and testify to a particular issue that was a real.
Oh, they were clear, yeah,
Okay,
both
but
being
Keith, that's
partisan.
can I just interrupt, that's sort of a different issue, and if we can get back to, because that's a second issue, but once we reach,
Okay, I'm sorry, I thought that's where he was going.
Well, it's that's the one where I sort of had that in mind when we were going to begin investigating, was this disclosed? And then we kind of realized, or at least I realized, going through the code, man, but if they disclose, as egregious as this is, and that's about as bad as it gets.
Okay, so one thing that I'm hearing, though, is that you had some other things going on besides ethics code violations. You had some due process violations going on. I mean, you can't, that other thing that we said, you can't sit on both sides of the thing. I mean, there's some, that besides substantial financial, if there's a whole great big thing out there, and the tip of the tail is, or one prong of it is that on top of everything else, dual roles and appearing in front of, and a procurement issue over here, and all this, is that there's a substantial financial interest. Even if the process has gone through to clear a person on the substantial financial interest, that fact that the board basically waives substantial financial interest can't also waive basic due process and the expenditure of public funds, and I mean a whole bunch of other things
And
about it.
The problem with, at least in this particular board, is it's a public board made up of people who have financial interest, and so they have knowledge of this stuff because they work in that particular area. It wasn't this particular board, but when I served on the Merrill Field Board, you had people who lived within an area, you had people who were pilots, you had people who had businesses on the property. So
in one way or the other, the mayor
Right,
appeal
but
board
when
has
they're gonna
conflicts.
be, but when they're gonna give testimony, they can't sit on the board and give testimony both. Just like that example that I gave. Not because they don't have a substantial financial interest, but because that's a conflict in the rules and responsibilities.
And I have one other question too. You mentioned that you couldn't proceed because of a violation of confidentiality. I admit I'm concerned about that because, wow, I know how to get my complaint dismissed now. I'm just gonna violate confidentiality.
No, it's
complaint-
the
complainant-
complainant.
The complainant actually published an
Not the
internet
person.
article. It came out very shortly, published it before they gave us the complaint, or actually submitted it to an online newspaper like the Alaska Dispatch.
Okay.
It was published after the complaint, and I can't go too far.
Right, no, that's okay.
It was published after we received the complaint.
Okay.
So,
The filer has an
so there is a
obligation of
rule
confidentiality.
that if you are gonna file a potential violation, then that is confidential. And you, the person who is filing the thing, cannot go public with that. And if you do go public with that, then this board is gonna dismiss it.
Because you've had your bite at the
You
apple.
picked your form.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
picked
okay,
your
got
form.
it, okay.
But what the concern was, we saw the due process issues, we had all these other things, but we at least at the time elected not to go any farther because the whole thing, I mean, it was a replicable.
Well, you know, and this was before we had the last training where you had said, we have all this advice, and we might have written a letter, but even then, we had already interviewed the person who was potentially conflicted that we would have written the letter about, and she was already making the defense, well, I disclosed it to my board, and they said it was okay. And we're like, at first we were like, that's irrelevant, look how egregious this is a conflict, and then when you look at the code, you're like, oh, actually, oh, wow, I think she might be right, that it's not just the assembly that gets to call those
Okay, and
shots.
Julie, can I point you what the board is
Okay.
concerned with? It's
Yeah.
1.15.035D,
Yeah.
additional provisions for elected officials. And D,
Okay, wait a minute, you're faster than I am, you were already there.
well, I was gonna read it into the record.
Okay, D.
Okay.
D? is
Yeah,
it D?
035D.
Right. Determination of whether a financial or private interest is substantial shall be made by the elected body on a case-by-case basis. The elected body shall be the final authority on whether the financial or private interest as disclosed is substantial. Okay, so we have a LURSA board.
Mhm.
So that's an elected body, and the LURSA board elects to say that what appears to be a common sense conflict of interest is not. You're saying this isn't determinative, because just because the board says we think
No,
you're-
that is gonna be determinative on whether the interest is substantial or not. The point that I was making
Okay.
was, if there is, he gave me the example of one person sitting and testifying on the table and then going back and being that. Okay,
Okay.
that's a due process
Okay,
problem.
all
Okay, then there was another thing on procurement. We have different rules on procurement. If you're gonna bid on a city contract or that's gonna use tax funds, then you have to go through all these hoops. And if you didn't go through those hoops when you acquired your substantial interest, then that LURSA board has no authority over waiving the code requirements for what you're supposed to do if you
Okay,
bid on a contract.
But they get a free ticket here as to
Conflict of
private
interest.
or ethic code, financial or private interest, where we would normally find that if we could reweigh, we would reweigh differently, very differently.
Right,
So then we have to look outside of the ethics code to things like procurement.
right. And you have to look at whether the disclosure was sufficient. Because that is the you can't, the ethics board cannot reweigh the factors, and the, someplace in here, here, it's limited. The jurisdiction of the board to determine a violation under this chapter by the elected official for participation in a matter after disclosure of a financial or private interest is expressly limited to the sufficiency of the disclosure. But you also have this thing down here about the public interest. And so, let's see, is this the same? Yeah.
Yeah,
So that's, the elected official shall place the public interest above the private. If an elected official's private relations or interest prevent an elected official from placing the public interest. So they have to go through, they have to ask, they have to do, the board has to work the thing, or they're not gonna end up with a sufficient, this is the LURSA board, or whatever that appointed board is, they're not gonna have had a sufficient disclosure. And so then you go under the deficiency of the disclosure. They didn't even go into whether this was gonna be a private interest that would diminish the public trust.
Okay, but then, Julia, do we get back to that, what was it, appearance of impropriety is not enough under this code? So, I'm gonna assume a situation where the disclosure is sufficient, the elected body has said, we don't care, or that is not a concern to us, but it looks bad, but there's your diminish of public trust, but this code specifically says appearance of impropriety is not enough.
So it's only an appearance that diminishes, because one of the things that I was saying is that they didn't go into an issue about whether the person, like the assembly will ask, do you think that this is something that, or the person who's making the disclosure will volunteer, and they'll say, I think that even though I don't have this and this and this and this, that I'm worried about the public trust here.
Mhm.
And so there is at least some analysis, either by the person making the disclosure or the body, as to how to gather data on the public trust issue. And so if they don't address the public trust component,
The board itself.
that board
That
down
board.
there, then this board can say that the sufficiency of the disclosure was insufficient, and here's
Mhm.
what we have to say about it.
So I'm just gonna jump ahead, Juliet. That's why it's so important for the assembly to read this into the record then. It doesn't matter if it's the LURSA or the assembly. When someone says, I have a financial interest to disclose, that's why the assembly needs to say, is the financial or private interest held, or a substantial amount of the matter considered? Does it vary? So that's why you go through the questions, because then this board can make that decision whether the disclosure was sufficient.
If they let the person stay. If they say no, like in the example he did, where
Mhm.
Bill Starr leaves, you don't have to go through all the thing if you're
Yeah, that's-
having
Right.
them leave.
But I mean,
But if
before you're
they're-
deciding.
Well,
Well,
again, I
except
don't-
if you have
Yeah.
enough facts if your decision is to recuse them, then it's not. They're
Right.
already done. You don't
Right.
have to go through all that.
My
But if
concern
it-
is not so much the assembly, which tends to be
Right.
a highly publicized, well-attended public meeting, it's on TV and all that kind of stuff. I'm worried about, these little LURSA boards,
Right.
or these smaller boards, smaller people, maybe you barely have a quorum, you all know each other, you're probably all neighbors, and we're gonna vote on something in which you clearly, and we're gonna vote whether approve this contract that you own the contracting business, right? We've gone through all the disclosure and everything, and at the end of the day, David says, oh, by the way, I own the contracting business who's gonna receive this contract. Oh, thanks, Dave, good job.
Thanks.
We vote on it anyway. To this board's mind, that would be a serious conflict in which David should not have been allowed to partake in both the discussion and that vote. But if he's disclosed it, and the three of us think it's okay,
Then they have a final
then it's
word.
okay. I can see that with the assembly. The assembly is the ultimate democratic body of the city. It's well publicized.
Right.
They need to take their lumps
see
if they're
your
gonna
point.
plow through and operate under conflicts of interest. There's gonna be a public penalty for doing so. That's not really true for these smaller
Well,
boards.
especially if it's a contract, because you have a
Right.
whole nother thing where it overlaps with that thing about being on both ends. That's the thing I hold up, where the mayor is here and he's here. You can't be voting
Yeah.
on
But I wonder
something
if
that's
this lets
gonna
you do
give
that. If
you.
you've gone through, if you've gone through all the procurement
That's right.
policy, and you've disclosed, and you've given your
And there's a
notice,
final
you
word.
gave your public notice that you were gonna compete
Yeah.
for this contract. This board would say, as a matter of ethics, that member should still not be allowed to deliberate and vote on the matter of that
Yeah,
contract.
they have a contract, they need to step aside.
But
But this sounds like they don't
I
have
know,
to.
I
Because they
know.
only have one
Whereas
contract
this-
that LURSA
yeah.
to administer, so why is that person even on that board?
So
Right.
we
Well,
issue
if they're
a
elected by
non-effectual
the
opinion.
people of the area, like we're talking
No, but
about,
we
the
can
Ursas,
ha-
for instance,
yeah.
they're elected by the people in the area, and it's a long-term, if it's a case where they're just now elected, and then, hey, I have a contract, I have a business, and I'd like a contract, and everybody understands that, and oh yeah, no problem, and we go forward. But when it's a long-term contract that's already in effect, and the person becomes a member of the board, and And everybody's well aware, including the people who elected him, that he is in the position he's in with the contract, and the contract is open disclosure and everything, then is it a violation?
Well, if, under the code, if the elected board has, if it's been disclosed and the elected board has said, oh no, that's okay, even if by any common sense reading, one of the board members has a substantial interest that is being considered by the board. In other words, if you took out this.
Okay, I gotta interrupt you for a second here, because we were looking under D.
Right.
L is, an elected official, a household member shall not acquire directly or indirectly an economic interest in a municipal contract or engage in business with a municipality unless the municipal contract is competitively solicited and all other requirements of this subsection are satisfied.
Which
Right.
I believe in this particular case we're talking about.
This is precisely the case
Okay,
I have
but
in
this
mind, that
goes
you've
on.
gone through and
It
you've
goes on.
satisfied all this other stuff. My view as from an ethical perspective is, even if you've satisfied all this other stuff, you filed all the notices, you filed your disclosures, you still should not be on that board voting
But you
for your
can't,
own
that's
contract.
right, because, and the reason why you can't is because part of what you have to fill out here is the elected officials shall not in fact or appearance attempt to improperly influence the award. That's number 3. The elected members and the elected officials' immediate family shall take no official action. Okay, that's number 4. With respect to development of the solicitation, award, or municipal administration of the contract. So you're prohibited, not because you had the substantial financial interest, but you can't even get there under the code.
Awesome.
So it's not like we had, it's what I'm telling you. You can't take the substantial financial interest is one piece. And in this case, it's the tail. Because the big meat of it is here in the dog's body, which is you have to go through this. Just as you said, it's probably a different rule if the person had a contract and was elected to the board. That comes under what they have to disclose in the beginning. And then they still have to create a firewall, and they can't be double dealing.
Well, in this
The
case,
administration.
Oh, look at that. Yeah.
So,
Hey, you're right, Dean. There's another 3 is another in fact or appearance language, right? So there's
Yeah,
some appearance
so-
language there too.
Yeah, so there are some places where appearance was in, but not in the common law rule that something was a conflict because it gave the appearance of a conflict instead of an actual conflict. We walked away from that. But where the appearance is that there's an actual conflict, and there is an actual conflict, then we didn't walk away. We didn't say, okay, just because it appears doesn't mean it's a conflict. I mean, that's the, and so some of them were delineated. And this contracting issue was a big deal because we had a lot of abuse going on.
Well, I can see where we may have to issue something where this individual has to resign from their LRSA or give up the contract, one or the other.
Yeah, because you can't do both. And before, there's a whole bunch of remedies about this, and some of them is that they have to return the money, some of them is they have to do that. I mean, it's a whole bunch of things that happen.
Now, Joy, I take it your view is probably, the view that we've taken is that when we get a notice of potential violation, part of the thing is that the filer is asked to cite the elements of the code that they think have been violated. We have read that rather broadly in the sense that we're almost like in a kind of de novo type case, like, okay, you've got a complaint here, we're willing to look at other sections of the
You
code,
have
that we
to look
don't
at other
just limit
sections.
ourselves to what the
Your
filer
yeah,
said. Right,
that
okay.
is, and they're not gonna be a lawyer.
That's yeah, right. And
But
they
that-
they're not
but
familiar with
that's-
the code, and
Right,
so,
and so, but that's to give you an idea about where they think that there is an issue. But your jurisdiction is over the entire code, so you can't put that burden on to somebody else.
Yeah, 'cause I
They're
think
not
this
your
is-
legal
Yeah, because I
advisor,
think
they're
this is when
not your.
we kind of got caught out, because you could imagine a case in which someone says, I think this is a conflict of interest problem, substantial interest problem, right? But as it turns out,
It's not
It's-
that, but
it's
it's
that,
this.
yeah, right,
So,
okay.
and that's why your question there is, if the facts were true, is it a violation of the code? Not if the facts were true, does it violate the
The
code that the
specific section.
complainant
Yeah.
happened to
That's
know
good.
about and bring forward?
that's good.
Okay.
looking at it, and it says it was moved to here, so.
So, are we on 6?
Okay, yeah, so 6, empowered by code to propose resolution settlement of, it should be of violations.
Oh,
I
that's
would say
true.
true.
Yeah,
Sure.
so you can get through your thing, and there's a special provision where you can stop the investigation there and not have to go through anything. If the person's saying, oops, I see I made a mistake, then you figure out what that resolution is and you short it there, and you save yourself and them some additional work there. So we talked about gatekeepers, that was number 7. The appearance of a conflict is sufficient to excuse an assembly member, or put in elected official, from further participation, and no ruling on behalf of the elected body is required. True or false?
Well, that's false.
That's false, because you need the body to make the ruling. There is no self-recusal unless the body goes along with it. Okay, Board of Ethics advisory opinions do not serve to bridge between the ethics code and application of the ethics code to particular situations not spelled out in the ethics code.
Oh, well, that's false.
That's it.
That's
false
right,
also.
that's
It's
false.
not
Sorry
a
for making it so
particular
complicated.
situation. Yeah, the question is, the question, you had to read the question several times.
Several
What
times,
is-
make sure you're not fouled up, so I didn't mean to, but I was, wanting to make that point. So, yeah, I mean, the thing is that we can't, there were a lot of complaints because the code took as many pages as it did. And many provisions between elected officials and appointed bodies and commissions and employees turned out to be pretty parallel. At the time when we undertook this, the one-size-fit-all had failed. That approach had failed for 5 to 7 years before I got there. So the only way that I could peel the onion was to have the assembly look at what governed elected officials and nail that down, and then do a separate chapter and a separate chapter. And in the end, they came out looking much more alike than I anticipated. But had I been left to more time and imagination to try and conceive of all the other possible scenarios where the code would have a gap that wasn't in there, then we'd have, a dictionary. And so the role of the board, as you saw in this opinion, which I attach here, and in the other opinions, part of the job is to kind of fill in that gap, to say, okay, here's what the code said, it went this far, here's something new that we don't see exactly covered by the code, here's our advisory opinion on it. And then until the code changes, that advisory opinion will be the rule. The assembly can always go back and say, oh no, we didn't mean it that way, we see that there's a gap, we're gonna fill it in. But until then that's the piece that was left to the citizen body here to kind of help us out with. 'Cause
Then we write another advisory opinion contradicting the assembly.
yeah, until they get it right. I mean, just like the legislature and the judicial branch, that's why they write dissents and everything, so they can help the Congress
But we
change what the
don't-
majority.
So
We don't need a
said.
2/3 vote to be able to make it happen.
So it's like the case law is the law of the land until the legislature change it.
Right, so the closest that we can come to that is with the advisory, because we're trying to do, proactive. And
So-
it is analogous to that.
So it demonstrates how important it is to get those opinions to the public, because that's what they're required to follow.
Right, and also to have them in, it's good to have them indexed by topic.
Oh, okay. Do we do that?
No. No, and so
Thank you.
that, that,
Yeah,
And which is easy.
That-
you
I
may
mean,
not have
it's-
had a chance, but our website needs some
Well,
maintenance.
actually, while we were sitting here, I sent one of my staff a text that says they want the website fixed. We need to get that done before the end of the year, so we're working on it. We'll get someone to
I
take a look
understand,
at
it's
it.
a lot of work.
So the opinions need to be indexed by,
yeah, there's a couple of things, but one is that that there was sort of a mismatch on the webpage as to somehow with advisory opinions, a person who's asking for the opinion under the code, they get to stay anonymous unless they waive confidentiality. The mayor has waived confidentiality on a lot of things that he asks for, but not everybody does. The opinion itself, there is no confidentiality over the opinion. You ask an opinion, the opinion gets to be published, just you get to remain anonymous. So what we had was where, on the webpage, where confidentiality wasn't waived, then we didn't have the opinion.
Oh.
Okay, that was a problem. Then in some cases, we had an opinion listed as to be this opinion for this, but the opinion that was behind that listing wasn't about that. Okay, and then the issue or the code sections or something so that you kind of have an idea that this is an opinion about conflict of interest under XYZ, or it's an opinion about the disclosure, about the school board's disclosure, about the gift, or about this, so that then you can kind of, because we're developing a body of them now. They're important, but if you have to open up each one to figure out what it's about, then it's not helping the board either.
Okay.
No, in all fairness, what you've got already though is that, you know, each one does, it's listed chronologically, but each one has a description of the subject of the opinion.
You know, that
And
is
so-
due to Julia. Julia asked us to do
Well, I
that
remember that's
this
what we
year.
started doing. So at least you've got, there's not that many, you can scroll, you know, in about
Right.
30 seconds
Yeah, so
through
you may be,
all
I
of them,
haven't looked at it
Well,
since
Julia-
I think
Yeah.
it's not so
recently,
bad, I
it's
think,
good,
right now, yeah.
Julia and Dee helped with this. When I first started, Julia did some training for the assembly members and said, how can I do this when I don't have the stuff?
Right.
So fortunately, we got it together for her.
If I can say what, and Joy,
Yeah.
You can say anything.
there should be, for the advisory opinions, some of them are listed as confidential and there's no document there, but that's not right? We've got scrubbed
Yeah.
versions of it. I know for like the wounded officer, like, we've got a scrubbed version. When I
There's-
wrote it, Keith couldn't even remember what case it was about. He was like, I don't even remember us talking about this. It was a completely generic, member of the municipality has this situation and they're, so we do
Those
have
should be
scrubbed
published.
opinions and they should go up, right? I mean, those
That's
should
right,
be
there,
public,
if the
right.
assembly did not want to have confidential advisory opinions, if you guys are going to all the work to do an analysis, then we need to know what the ruling is, because otherwise, they want it to be advice not only for the person who asked for it, but for that body and for the municipality as a whole.
Yeah, so there's about 7. It's almost
So
a
no
third of them are
secret
confidential,
opinions
right.
to one person that they can just decide when they're gonna whip it out and tell everybody else about it, because whatever benefit they got or were denied under the opinion should be applicable to everybody in
We
their
should
class.
check whether that's clear on the request form, that whether or not they waive confidentiality, that the opinion at some point will be issued,
Okay.
because that's what misleading to that person. When
Yeah,
they
that's a
say
good point, yeah.
confidential, non-confidential, and then,
We can include the language, there's specific language in the code
In the
that
code
says
that
that,
says
a
that they're
generic,
not.
you know,
Yeah,
generic.
yeah.
give
But
really
just so
good
they know that
details.
up
Yeah,
front.
absolutely, yeah, because
Yeah,
it's not as
notice.
confidential as they might realize.
Yeah.
right? And,
well, and, you know, they're supposed to be scrubbed opinions, but a good deal of them, I think, are difficult to
Too
be.
small a town to scrub everything.
And that
Assembly
will-
members are supposed to know the code. Anyway,
I'll leave that to you.
right, right. So that's something we can also stress in the assembly member training. Okay, I'm hoarse.
Thank you,
And
Julia.
thank you.
well
This is
into
really,
your,
really
That was
good.
very helpful.
thing. Do I get to collect these back?
Yes. Should we take a couple-minute break before you start your
Yeah.
meeting?
Yeah, that's a good idea, I might get some more.
Okay.
Don't get to keep these?
Thank you,
Yeah,
Julie.
I've been using them for training, so my